Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me in the ITV Networks. With me today is Professor Sreeram Chaulia. He is the Professor and Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs in Sonipat, India. Sreeram Chaulia has written the book Politics of the Global Economic Crisis, Regulation, Responsibility and Radicalism, which is now available for the last 2 months. And being in South Africa, he has raised interesting discussions and debates about India's foreign policy and domestic issues within India. And I thought that it would be an ideal time to chat with him, considering the controversial debate around the Mazibuya Forum and the discussion about Indians and their role in South Africa. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here and for giving me this time.
It's my pleasure, Coach.
And I must say that you're very young to be a professor and a dean basically of a university. I mean, South Africa, when we conceive of professors, it's usually like 55 or 60 years, age category. So it shows that the developing world has got a strong momentum.
The gray hair is coming. I'm not far behind. Younger people, I think, India, for example, median age is just 25, 26.
Yes.
So there is a sense of the baton is being transferred to a new generation. And we hope to be able to live up to expectations of the masses and of the society at large and of the global south at large. Because youth power is eventually what creates a freshness in thinking and about future directions and how to steer nations and regions and the world out of negative tendencies towards positive ones.
And I think that's very important in politics too, because if you look at many of the political leaders in less developed countries than in developing countries, we're usually clinging to the old school, to the older leaders. We need to take a break, I think, and move away towards younger leaders.
In India, we have this term gerontocracy. Grey-haired, silvery-haired people, even well into their 70s and 80s who want to remain in politics and to dominate it. In this region, you have people like Robert Mugabe, who's 90 and still hanging on to power by hook or crook. So I think it's necessary for younger people to be given a chance. And at our university, our Vice Chancellor is the youngest Vice Chancellor in the country, deans, faculty members. We've tried to, consciously hire younger people who are highly driven, motivated, and highly skilled and knowledgeable. So I think that's necessary also in an educational institution. As you know, younger faculty members are closer to students, and it helps in mentoring, it helps in grooming students to also think in a more democratic fashion. Because if the deans and the vice chancellors are demigods and they're far away and you can't even access them, I think it creates a gulf which is bad. So we need to also think from a pedagogical point of view in the educational system how youth can be force for transformation.
And considering this concept of transformation, you have come now to South Africa to speak a little bit about university and to invite students from across the developing South to come and share in the knowledge that you are busy disseminating to people. So tell us a little bit more about your university and why have you specifically visited South Africa?
OP Jindal Global University is a social science exclusive university. It's a private university created by the state government of Haryana, which is just outside Delhi, in the national capital. And we are a social science exclusive, and the reason we've focused on these fields is because these have been neglected in India. India is better known for engineering and for medical school, and we produce dime a dozen. There's so many of them now, millions coming out, and some of them without the adequate skills, because quality has been compromised in the drive for quantity. Every nook and corner of the country, you have a college of engineering or a medical school. So what we didn't want to do when we created this university was to replicate it. We wanted to fill the gap in the social sciences that had been neglected in economics, in politics, in sociology, and allied fields, in law, and so on. And therefore, this university was created with the express intent of raising the quality of higher education in social sciences in the country, creating the critical thinking that's necessary as a developing country emerges. Because without the social sciences, we are all becoming automatons, and that should not be the case. We should have, the heart and the soul and the mind all together. And that can only happen when you have quality education in the humanities and social sciences.
And considering that India is such an old civilization, I mean, you have an entire history of development and thought. If you neglect the social sciences, you're beginning to neglect your history.
Exactly. And I think we have a situation where a lot of the people who are coming with only technical education are missing the pulse of the society and what the society wants. So you have, a move towards self-centered materialist accumulation, but rather than thinking about the larger community and the world at large. So our School of International Affairs, which I had, we have a very unique master's program in diplomacy, law and business, which I hope more African students are going to join. And we are open for admissions right now, actually. What this program does is to train young people to think about the developing world at large, the global south, and how we can raise our own status and profile in the world, and how we can live with equality and dignity. So these things, I think we have to invest in the humanities and social sciences. And OP Jindal Global University and our Jindal School of International Affairs are small attempts towards this end.
So are you encouraging students to come from the global south to come to university? Do you offer scholarships, etc.? What is what is the catch? Why would they want to come to India and perhaps not go to the West or go to Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Quraysha. This is the central, the crux of the matter. India is increasingly being looked upon as a leadership potential to drive the agenda of South-South cooperation and to revive the historically colonized peoples of the world. And therefore, there's a lot of onus on India to be able to offer some thought leadership. And our university, our School of International Affairs especially, we're trying to develop that. Can there be an Indian School of International Relations? Can there be an Indian viewpoint that takes into account the historical inequities that have been imposed upon us through colonial and neo-colonial practices? And is there a way we can offer a lead to our brothers and sisters in the developing world? So this is where I think the onus lies on India to produce knowledge in the social sciences. And our university is an attempt at doing that. We're accepting students from Africa. We already have students from many African countries like Kenya, Angola, Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, and so on. And South Africa, we hope to have many more in the years.
So if anybody wants to apply to university, which website would they go to?
So they go to www.jsia.edu.in. That's Jindal School of International Affairs.
Okay.
And the website is self-explanatory. There's an online application process. There's no fee charge for application. And we are offering many generous scholarships for developing country students, sometimes up to even 100% of the tuition being covered if they're meritorious and if they have family incomes that also deserve of needs-based financial aid. We're doing it, and our principle has always been to for class should not be a barrier for knowledge acquisition, and that's so central for upward mobility in societies. If you give young people who are bright and inquisitive and curious a chance to live up to their potential, no matter whether they come from the lowest segments of society or not. I mean, that is where I think societies have a chance to rise up.
We're speaking about the need to create a transformative curricula in order to change the narrative in the way in which international states actually rule the current system. And of course, to give academics and individuals the opportunity to bring forth their contributions and to show how the global south perceives itself. So, Sreeram, I think that's a very important point that you raised, because we find that people in the African continent battling with an African identity. South Africans are now battling with a South African identity. And all of these voices basically are on the periphery, because it's not as if they don't have knowledge, it's not as if they don't have a history or they don't have a philosophy, but there is a dominant narrative like realism, idealism, etc., that controls basically the way in which states are perceived, or even in the way in which academic informations disseminate knowledge and information. So, as I told you before, if I wasn't married, I would have definitely come to your university to study. So moving from transformative curricula, we know that's important. And for South Africa too, the key point at the moment, I think after this elections, is going to be how do we transform our curricula, because at the moment it's still neo-colonial and colonial in many ways. It perpetuates more of the same. There is also a need to raise the question about transformative ideologies. What kind of ideology are you proposing, or do you suggest that the world needs?
Quraysha, I think 21st century, through technological change, through generational change, we are on the cusp of some major new ideas. I think the socialism, communism, capitalism, all these major dominant global ideologies came out of a materialistic basis. And the whole focus was on accumulation of one sort or the other. And the emphasis was on material factors, military power, GDP, economic growth, and we have fetishized these things for a long time. So what this has done is, in many ways, it has harmed the environment. We know the ecological disaster that's facing us in this century. So I think in the global south, we need to be coming up with alternatives. The one philosophy which is common between Africa and India is the idea of your humanity is mine and vice versa, and we need to support each other through thick and thin based on solidarity. We can call this South-South cooperation, you can call it Ubuntu. In India, we have Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the world is one family. These kind of ideas, I think, can be the basis for creating non-Western pedagogies and non-Western ontologies. That's when we'll be able to come up with new ways of interacting with each other. It need not be an exploitative exchange. It can actually be one where your strengths and my weaknesses are somehow coming together, and it leads to common upward mobility for the entire global south. I think these are the kind of new philosophies we need to develop, and these are not new in the sense that they exist in our traditional heritage. And we have also, as you know, traditionally, before the advent of capitalism, matrilineal, matriarchal societies. And what happened to all of them? I mean, the onslaught of materialism has in many ways taken the power away from women in our societies. And we need to give it back. And how can we do it? I think we can only do it by reaffirming some of our older traditions. There is a tendency to think that modern, quote unquote, is Western in the sense that it is more egalitarian and somehow it gives more personal freedoms and liberties. But the reality of Western colonialism of the last 300 years is something else. So the equality that we're talking about was not really available to majority of the people in the world. Malcolm X used to say, the majority of the people in the world are colored people. And we never got this equality or liberty from the French Revolution. Napoleon was talking about these revolutionary ideas for France, but was colonizing Haiti and was killing people in Egypt. So we need to think about how we can create a new kind of humanity where everybody, at least in status and dignity, is equal, and how we can advance these through new kinds of theories and paradigms in academia. That is, I think, the search that we have to make commonly in South Africa and India.
Now, you've raised a very important point. We speak about a common dignity and a common humanity. But in South Africa, in the KwaZulu-Natal province, at the moment we have a group that's called the Mazibuya Forum that is raising its head, basically, and it's attacking Indians, saying that Indians must leave the province, that Indians must get out, that Indians must go back to India. Now, I know that race and racial identity is in many ways a social construct, okay? And in times of elections, etc., when people want to get votes or want to generate power for themselves, they will appeal to specific hate speech, etc., in order to get a dominant idea. But what has been India's role in terms of supporting the African people or people of color in South Africa? And do you believe that Mazibuya Forum would be correct in telling Indians of South Africa that are now South African citizens that you have to get out and go back to India?
Xenophobia of all forms is harmful to society. One can understand the economic frustrations of downtrodden black people in this country who might feel that the people of Indian origin are better off and are doing and are more prosperous, and this can generate animosities. I think a lot of this has to do with social policies and the black empowerment and how successful it has been in this country, and that feeds off into these kinds of outlets as safety valves in a way. Violence, attacking, be it Zimbabweans or Indians or whatever. But I think we have to also put this in the larger context of race and class are somehow, they've always gone together, and these have in many ways vitiated it. So I think my own opinion, humble opinion, is Indians who are in Africa and who are doing well must also try to integrate themselves better with local communities, and this must not become a gated community versus a ghetto kind of situation. And that is where I think the danger lurks. I am also reminded of the Chinese minorities in Southeast Asia, who are also very wealthy and who often are resented by local people in Southeast Asian countries because they are in business and they are into trade and they control most of the economy. I don't think Indians are that powerful in this country, which is, as you know, the economic lever is still mostly in the hands of white people. But nonetheless, when you're an intermediate layer in the society, the responsibility lies on you also to not to increase the differences and the animosities, but to try and work out institutions, formal and informal, where we can have common gatherings and social intercourse in such a way that it doesn't build up to violence or to xenophobia.
Okay, now thanks, Manu. We have to go to a break, but I want you just to consider a little bit quickly, for the benefit of the audience, what has been India's role in supporting the ANC?
India is historically a major ally of the anti-apartheid movement, and Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi were major inspirations for great figures like Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Nelson Mandela. And I think we come from the same legacy of opposing European colonialism, and it continues to be a major bedrock of Indian foreign policy to support the rise of the global South. After they have broken out of formal colonialism, there are still different means by which Western countries have tried to impose themselves and to exploit the natural wealth of Africa and Asia and so on, and Latin America. And it's increasingly important for a country like India to take the lead in finding ways and means to strengthen ourselves to the point where we cannot become vulnerable to these external machinations.
Yes, Sreeram, you were explaining about India asserting itself, and I want to now raise the question about India's foreign policy. Perhaps I can put it to you in two parts. The first question will be, is India's role in the BRICS association? And secondly, what is India doing in Africa?
In the BRICS formation, India, I would say, is one of the pillars. We have believed in a multipolar world where there are multiple centers rather than one which is dominated by Washington or London or Berlin. And our idea in collaborating with fellow BRICS member countries, which include South Africa, is to try and give momentum to this power shift that's going on from west to east and north to south. And most of us are in the global South. And the idea was that by coming together and coordinating our policies, economic as well as security and political and diplomatic strategies, we will be able to present a united front that in many ways negates some of the exploitative practices that have been occurring in a very iniquitous international order. So our goal in many ways harks back to the original pledge of developing countries in the 1970s at the United Nations for a new international economic order where we have sovereignty over our own wealth and resources, and where we are able to devote our resources for economic uplift of our people rather than in destructive military rivalries. So that is, I think, the peace and the justice agenda has to be up front and central in BRICS. There are tendencies in some BRICS countries to also think that BRICS is simply a means and a mechanism for achieving great power status, which may satisfy the ego of elites, but doesn't necessarily translate into better living conditions for our own people. So BRICS, while challenging the established order, must also be cognizant of the fact that we have the bulk of the poor in our own societies and also very highly unequal societies. If you look at the Gini coefficients of BRICS countries, they're explosive. So we don't have much to brag about, but the power of the youth that I spoke about early on is what is giving us hope that in these BRICS countries, with except Russia, most of us are growing and young populations, and the median age is low, and there are young people who want to do something big and to think out of the box and to come out, work for their communities, for their countries, and for the region as a whole. What India is doing in Africa, I would say, India is smaller than China in its footprint. It doesn't have the same kind of economic resources or the fat checkbook that the Chinese carry. And we are mostly into small and medium enterprises. And we are not very state-guided and state-directed. So our corporations, our presence in Africa, it has been smaller. And it has also been meaningful. I was just in Botswana last week, where I saw Indians are doing so well in the retail sector, in automobiles and so on, and they are not there to build massive airports or bridges like the Chinese do, and they don't bring thousands of engineers along with them, and which creates rifts between local people and the Chinese. So we try to be, tread softly, and I think that is inherent to our national psyche as well. We don't want to be aggressive and to dominate, and that's not been the case at all. But nonetheless, people are worried about what these giants from Asia are going to do in Africa. Are they here for another scramble to take away the resources? And I think this is important. We are cognizant of this. We need to be sensitive. I think, especially in the South-South cooperation context, there's an allegation that these upwardly mobile countries like China and India are leaving behind poorer countries and are in many ways looking down upon them as if they don't matter. So I think we have to change these
perceptions,
mindsets. And the Indian elites also, I'm also critical of Indian establishment sometimes when I say that we need to be much more careful not to convey the impression that we are there to come grab the minerals and get out of the countries.
You raise a very important discussion, and I think that comes to the way in which we manage ourselves, that Indians must not be seen again as exploitative. So you're replacing one kind of exploitation with another. The colonialists have left, and now the Asians have come in. But from this discussion and the way in which India is now managing its relationships, whether it is with South-South cooperation, there's an important question, and I think that's for the benefit of my viewers. We know that India has a very strong relationship with Israel. So considering the current climate and the way, well, you know, Israel is another colonial occupying force in the Middle East. Palestine is still under occupation. If India has this moral higher ground, this need to be cognizant about the perceptions and feelings of other people, how is it then that India is still partnering or trading or perhaps forming an alliance with Israel? What is India's role in this particular conflict?
Croatia, it's not an alliance. I would say it's a mutually beneficial relationship that India has struck with Israel in the last 20 years. Since establishment of diplomatic relations. It's mainly cooperation in the defense sector. India does not have its own military industrial complex or manufacturing ability and is dependent on imports. It used to be dependent excessively on Russia, and so they wanted to diversify away from it. Israel has some advanced military technology, and India is buying it, and they're also doing co-production and joint development of certain weapon systems that help India in a hostile neighborhood because the Chinese perception that there's a rivalry with China and so on. So the other thing, Israelis are also helping us with agriculture technology and in improving our crop productivity and yields. You know, it's a rising population, and we need a second agricultural green revolution to be able to feed our people and also to export. So there are some pragmatic reasons they're doing this, but this has not come at the expense of our traditional and consistent support for Palestinian statehood. India is a major supporter of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and supports the state-building institutions which will likely convert into a UN membership hopefully in the future. India has always voted for Palestinian statehood, and we continue to have solidarity for the cause of the Palestinian people. So what this means is that we are also careful not to to antagonize the Islamic part of the world. We have traditionally very strong relations with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, and many other countries. We import a lot of oil from the Middle East. So if we're dependent on Israel for weaponry, we're dependent on Islamic countries for oil. So in that sense, you can call it a balance. And more importantly, I think what is necessary is that we, having accorded diplomatic recognition to Israel, believe in Israel's right to exist. But that doesn't mean that we condone what they're doing in the occupied territories. India has consistently opposed settlement construction and human rights abuses that are going on there.
Okay, we're in the final part of this particular segment, which brings us to the close. And so quickly I want to touch on domestic issues. The first one, of course, is that the gender violence, specifically against females in Delhi, and you're from Delhi as well, the rape of women. How is that being managed, and what do you think is needed by the Indian government? And secondly, what is India going to do to try and lift the majority of its population out of poverty?
Sexual violence, unfortunately, seems to be on the increase. Statistically, it may not be, but at least the way it's been getting reported, it shows there are some very, very horrific acts of violence that are happening, and we are all concerned about it, especially in Delhi, in northern India. I think it has to do with the kind of population migration patterns and the conservative value systems and the clash with the so-called modernity that's happening there. So it's a deeper sociological problem that we need to address. There are a lot of stereotypes about women that have also perpetuated this violence. There's objectification going on, and on top of all this income and class status, the feminization of poverty is quite intense in India, as it is in most parts of the world, which means that women tend to be on the weaker side of most bargains. And this is where one has to think about female participation in the labor force, for example, is abysmally low in India. So all these factors add up, I think, to this. In fact, I'm in the state of Haryana, where we are also worried about female feticide, which is another major crime. It's illegal, but nonetheless, social practices, conservative patriarchal values have been entrenched for centuries, and they are being now used to reproduce this. So I think we have to fight this subtly. I mean, because if you go into the rural areas, the patriarchy is very, very deep-rooted. And if you question it, your life can be at threat. But there are ways in which academic. We are located in Haryana, in the state of Haryana, and we're trying to work with local communities, with activists, with citizen groups, with volunteers to try and gradually change their attitudes. As you know, these things have been entrenched for a while, especially in northern India. You don't see that as much as in southern or western India, but certainly in the northern parts. So these things, we need to, I think, that's where I said we have to reinvent some of our older traditions where woman was on top and she was respected. And we have to go back there, and it cannot be just through sloganeering. It is through increasing women's participation in the economy, giving value to their household work, and changing the way that their labor is currently rated.
I know we've come to the end, and I would like to conclude by just summing up what you've said, and that's very, very important in terms of the dialogue that's coming out of the South, that you need to engage with the people rather than to dictate to them as to what to do. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here and for sharing these insights with me about India and Indian perceptions as well.
Thank you, Quraysha.
Okay, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Until we meet again, we'll see you next time.